sort of dictate the terms of the agenda. I don't exactly have too much to share. I'll sort of talk about, I suppose, my reactions to the presentation we just watched, and then describe my paper in broad overview, which is now a few months out of date at least. So I think the big picture argument still stands, and I'll sort of rehash that if everyone's willing. But hopefully it will just leave a lot of time for discussion, if that's all right with you.
Absolutely, yes, please do.
Excellent. Well, I don't have PowerPoint slides, so I hope nobody is starting to get tired after dinner or anything. I don't want to bore you too much. So responding to Dr. Morton's presentation just now, a few things come to mind. First of all, I did watch Dr. Bill Weiss's recent presentation to your group, or a different chapter thereof, in which he responded to the same video and noted that, in fact, there was no king in Myanmar, or in Burma, in 1948. Rather, it was Aung San Suu Kyi's father, General Aung San, who was assassinated in 1948. The last king of Burma, Thibaw Min, was exiled by the invading British in the 19th century. So the good doctor might have his history a bit confused, but otherwise it's a very interesting presentation. I would, as a Southeast Asia scholar, take a bit of issue with his use of the term alliance for the grouping, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN. In fact, the bloc of 11 countries rather explicitly avoids using the terminology of alliances. And on top of that, it's relatively far from united. In fact, the Myanmar coup, I would argue, has been probably the biggest dividing and divisive issue in its recent history. So you'll see a very varied response among mainland Southeast Asia and maritime Southeast Asian countries. Particularly Malaysia recently has been very vocal in its support of the opposition national unity government, which I'll talk about a bit in my paper. A couple other points, I think many of us will have read in the news about the Rohingya crisis in recent years. This is actually the current crisis, which the presentation noted began in 2016, has much longer historical roots. In fact, dating back to the era of British colonialism. So the Rohingya, a Muslim minority group that settled in Arakan state historically some centuries and many decades ago, across several generations now, have been subject to periodic discrimination and targeting by various governments across Burma's history, as well as the military. Beginning most notably, I think, in the 1970s, when General Ne Win initiated violent expulsions of Indian and Chinese citizens, and a lot of the violence ended up directed against the Rohingya. But previous exoduses and repatriation also occurred in the 1990s. And then more recently in 2012, a time when I was in the American embassy, actually, the Burmese, or the violence between Buddhists and Muslims had definitely been sounding alarm bells in the capital, or actually in Yangon, where many embassies were carefully watching the issue, and NGOs from around the world were trying to respond to the brewing crisis and inter-religious strife going on. So it has a much longer history, dating back many decades. Now, to situate the recent coup of February 2021 in Myanmar's recent history with tentative steps toward democracy, I think rather than sort of locate the cause in the 2020 election, which the military and its proxy party, the Union Solidarity and Development Party, or USDP, and forgive me for all the acronyms and terminology, when the military took issue with the results of the election, which favored Aung San Suu Kyi's party, the National League for Democracy, that might have been the proximate cause, the immediate cause for the coup in many ways. But in fact, the tension had been looming and really was inbuilt into the political system of Myanmar from the 2008 constitution, which the military itself drafted. to protect its interests, both political power and economic control. But at the same time, it enshrined 25% of all parliamentary seats across the country, both at the federal level and at the local level. And it allowed for a degree of political participation that had not been seen in many decades, and in fact caused the military a great deal of concern after Myanmar's parliament convened for the first time in 2011. And so this sort of power struggle between Aung San Suu Kyi, who was under house arrest for about 2 decades and then rose to power as state councillor, had really sort of set this chessboard up for an inevitable tension, and one that ultimately was irreconcilable because Commander-in-Chief Min Aung Hlaing decided to launch a coup and take back power by force. And I'll talk more about the coup in my comments on my paper. Finally, last comment I would make on the presentation we just watched. I found it interesting that the professor noted that the United States should act in concert with the United Kingdom, the EU, Japan, and India. I think that's correct in many ways, although I see a great deal of divergence with Japan and India in particular, as well as Australia, another ally of the United States and a country in which I personally reside. I'm actually home in the United States right now. You can probably hear I'm an American, not an Australian. But sitting in Canberra, I'm frequently reminded that Australia's perspective and response to the Myanmar coup has been vastly different from that of other Western countries. So the United States, mostly in lockstep with the United Kingdom and the EU, has announced a series of targeted sanctions against the Myanmar military and its economic corporations. But Japan and India notably have abstained and adopted more realpolitik responses to the coup. So moving on, I'm not sure how many of you, if anyone, had a chance to read my rather long essay here for Great Decisions, but I'll sort of rehash some of my main argument. And this was written towards the end of last year and published earlier this year, I think in January. So some of the figures have changed and some events have changed a bit, particularly as ASEAN has grappled with its own response to the coup. But by and large, I think my analysis still stands, and I'll stand by my own diagnosis of the overall situation. A few broad points, which I think are sort of the central elements of my paper. Firstly, despite numbering more than 300,000, which is a disputed figure among Myanmar scholars, the military has actually never managed to control the country in its entirety. And that really, the struggle we see today, rather than being sort of on the verge of civil war, Myanmar has really been at war continuously since its independence in 1948, with many groups, including the Communist Party of Burma and the Karen, notably launching insurgencies rather, against the central government and the Myanmar military very early after independence. At a time, notably, when Myanmar's military, or Burma's military, was far weaker and was nearly overrun back in the 1950s, actually. So this was a time of state consolidation and the military really sort of centralizing its control over the institutions of Burma and taking a great deal of power, which it ultimately used to supplant the civilian government in 1958 and again in 1962. Usurping power from then leader U Nu. And the military has relied historically on tactics of divide and rule because it's incapable of actually controlling all of the many restive frontiers and different armed groups across the country's periphery. So most recently, the military has tried to placate one of the larger armed groups, the United Wa State Army, which essentially has its own autonomous zone in the country's north, and has used similar tactics to try to reason with the large Arakan army in the west, which with whom it signed a ceasefire agreement in early 2020. My next major point is that the pretext of the current coup is blatantly illegal. The military has actually sort of gone back and forth on how to rationalize the reasoning for the coup. It has used various provisions within its own drafted 2008 constitution to try to legitimize the coup. But it actually sort of bungled the process, and by detaining President Win Myint on February 1st, 2021, it actually eliminated its own any credibility to its claims that it was acting within the 2008 constitution to declare a state of emergency and transfer power. And at the same time, it's pursued really bogus political charges against State Councilor Aung San Suu Kyi and other members across her political party, the National League for Democracy, including violating COVID-19 restrictions during the 2020 campaign period and possession of illegal walkie-talkies, among other things. In reality, as I noted earlier in my remarks, I think it was Min Aung Hlaing, the commander-in-chief, who was not comfortable with power sharing and the arrangement that was made by the Tatmadaw or Myanmar military itself under the 2008 constitution. So it's rather ironic that the military ultimately refused to live within the very strict confines of its own political engineering, which it had put in place to guarantee its interests were protected. And really, the National League for Democracy, despite trying to change the 2008 constitution, never actually manifested a clear and existential threat to the Myanmar military. Nevertheless, Min Aung Hlaing, for lust for power or other unknown reasons, decided to take back power by force. My third broad point is that the opposition national unity government, which has arisen since the coup beginning in April of last year, its main challenge is to convince the international community to support it and grant it de facto, unofficial, or even official diplomatic recognition to lend it further support and even financial assistance and logistical assistance to take on more of the trappings of a state, and that is to govern and ensure public goods for its people, including healthcare, police safety, and education, some of which, and much of which it's already actually doing in the territory it controls. Another thing it's important to sort of tease out here in the sort of sea of acronyms that is always has always afflicted Burma studies is that there's a civil disobedience movement, there's a national unity government, CDM, NUG, there's a CRPH, the committee representing the Kirongsu Hluta, which is Myanmar language for the national parliament, and now People's Defensive Forces, the PDFs that have sprung up across the country. All of these moving pieces are acting in communication with one another, sometimes under and alongside one another. But the lack of overall coordination among these different bodies resisting the coup, and that includes ethnic armed groups that have been at war with the military for many decades prior to the current coup. But all of those moving pieces end up meaning that the military ultimately has some benefit as long, or has an advantage as long as these groups are unable to unite into a cohesive whole. And that's true as well of the international response to the junta and the coup. I've noted that ASEAN in particular has major divisions preventing real action and meaningful action in response to the coup. Dr. Morton's presentation noted the 5-point consensus, which only emerged in April, 2 months after the coup. So it took some time even to find this limited consensus agreeing to the cessation of violence and dialogue between all sides, none of which has materialized so far. And beyond that, ASEAN was very slow to nominate a special envoy and subsequently has replaced the envoy, leading to a rather ad hoc and chaotic diplomatic response, and one that's sort of doomed to repeat itself over and over again, as long as the position is not more permanent.
That's the gentleman from Brunei, correct?
Yes, Cambodia took over from Brunei most recently and has adopted a bit of an unconventional approach. Cambodia, generally speaking, is more welcoming of Myanmar back into the fold, whereas some of the maritime countries of Southeast Asia, including Indonesia and Malaysia, have been a lot more careful to keep the junta at arm's length and not include them in ASEAN high-level summits. Actually, and that brings to an end the remarks I wanted to make, sort of the core points I'm trying to emphasize from my paper. I'm happy to discuss at greater length. I'd also note that Ma Nyan, who I recently met at a Myanmar conference in Singapore, Lucas and Ko Ye are all more capable than myself in explaining many of these topics and have done fine work on Myanmar and the coup in their own writing and reporting.
Why don't we go with ladies first?
So I'll welcome questions as however you want to do it, or comments and feedback as well.
I would like to ask on the COVID-19, what has happened since your report was done?
A very good question. So when I wrote the report, I think I had noted Myanmar's disastrous third wave of COVID in roughly August, September last year, and the junta's inability to respond to that. Because at first the military was hoarding COVID relief supplies and testing kits and was slow to import vaccines, mostly from China, although India, the United States, and some other countries have also promised to deliver COVID vaccines as well. And the United States in particular has been generous with its support for Southeast Asia in delivering COVID vaccines across the region. But much of the problem is the disagreement about how to deliver humanitarian assistance, which invariably now goes through junta channels and military channels within Myanmar. Somewhat miraculously, it would seem that the junta was able to lower the overall positivity rate in the country. The number of cases did decline, but the data is very suspect, so it's really difficult to know. The rate of deaths due to COVID slowed somewhat. It was really escalating near the second half of 2021. In 2022, I think the situation is a bit more under control, but the population remains overwhelmingly unvaccinated and unable to test for, let alone treat, the majority of its citizens and patients across the country who lack access to basic health care.
Thank you.
Would any of our guests like to make a comment?
Hunter, this is Susan Miller. I sent an inquiry about what is the economic impact of the meth trade that's going on there, not only for Myanmar, but also for the region, and does that have any impact on instability?
It's an excellent question, and definitely not something I have expert knowledge on particularly, but it's boomed since the coup. There's a surge in methamphetamine sales, and some of that began around the beginning of COVID. Some of it predates that. Much of it also has benefited from the instability in the western state of Rakhine, where the Rohingya were expelled across the border into Bangladesh and sadly have become sort of swept up in a bit of this drug trade. And unfortunately, I think very vulnerable populations have been used to smuggle some of the meth. It's also importantly going across the border to China, where some of its main sort of components in the production come from originally, the synthetic chemicals, and also goes across the border to Thailand, as well as overseas to Malaysia. So it's really impacting regional stability, much like the COVID pandemic has already, as well as the flow of human refugees and people fleeing state violence. So it's all part of this broader trend. And the other thing I would note is that it's not limited to the sale of meth, but all sorts of human trafficking, sale of illicit gems, including jade from Kachin State in the north across the border to China, much of which is unreported and benefits the military's coffers, and timber, notably, which the Myanmar military also has extensive control over. So a lot of this is being sold across the border to China, but the meth trade is really surging right now. And UNODC and other analysts have done some really good work tracking the numbers here and sort of the origins of the meth production.
And my second question was COVID a mechanism for them to consolidate power? I mean, you can.
I think yes. You know, it's hard to sort of say one way or the other. I think, you know, for better or worse, Myanmar's military has never really had the most advanced surveillance and control tactics. You know, for want of its, I think the military would really like to be an authoritarian or totalitarian sort of entity, but it's unable to really control the people, which I think is evident, you know, in the extent of the resistance across the country and just the flaunting of junta control in many creative ways. But with COVID, you know, you saw just the general collapse of Myanmar's healthcare system and the inability of hospitals to respond. Some of the better hospitals are in the larger cities, and in the countryside, much of the country still remains below the poverty line and lacking basic healthcare access. So in some ways, that sort of illegibility, which is the language one anthropologist uses to describe sort of the upland tribes of Southeast Asia, actually means that the government or the junta is unable to really control with full surveillance its body populace.
Would any of our guests have any comments they would like to, or observations they would like to make?
Perhaps our two Myanmar guests today.
Wow, they've absolutely sold on your lecture, Hunter.
Lucas, you must be able to push back somewhere or find a hole in my argument.
You know, I think it was, you know, and Hunter, I think your argument's very solid, and especially, you know, obviously things have moved really rapidly, even in the last few months since your article came out. And I guess the one thing that I would touch on, this is more just building off of your argument, is that in my view, I think a lot of the situation really is now a question of military struggle in the sense that now the outcome in Myanmar, in my view, is very much going to be decided, I think, in the armed struggle. Whether that leads to, you know, pressure on the junta so much that it forced to negotiate, whether that means the junta is able to consolidate, I don't think so. I actually think that right now what we're going to be seeing is a much more, you know, just continued violence and escalation in many areas, as, you know, potentially social order could break down further. I think the junta is losing control in some places, but generally I think right now it's much more moving in that direction, that we're going to see an extended military conflict.
Right. I can't disagree with that.
Next month, actually, the topic from the Great Decision book is actually on the Quad, which is obviously an alliance that was built, was constructed very recently as a result of China's incursion in Southeast Asia. I'm half curious to know whether, in fact, the Quad could be a player in the neighborhood.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, especially in relation to the Myanmar coup. And partly because of the divergence I noted already between Quad members. So Australia and India and Japan have all been a bit more, I don't know if pragmatic is the right word, but reluctant to ostracize the Myanmar military entirely. Australia and Japan have both had training and education programs with the Myanmar military for some time now. And India's own relations with Myanmar military have generally strengthened in the last decade as they've cooperated on counterinsurgency in their shared border region. And India has also sold Myanmar its first submarine, I think, to the Myanmar Navy. So close ties there, and none of them are really willing to push too hard and alienate the junta. But the U.S. there is sort of the outlier.
And if I may, I think, Hunter's exactly right that there's a lot of divergent interests within the Quad countries. And on some level, I've increasingly felt that the Quad is maybe not the right fora for this situation because, one, you have ASEAN obviously is the primary actor, and it is U.S. policy that ASEAN centrality be the one of its main focuses, and what ASEAN centrality means in diplomatic speak is essentially that ASEAN is the central forum for regional diplomatic discussions, and the U.S. has consistently emphasized that ASEAN should lead on this issue. Now, of course, as the lecture from Dr. Morton discussed, and as Hunter's piece argues very persuasively, ASEAN is quite limited in what it can do, especially given its own internal divisions. But I think the Quad is arguably similarly divided, and you have India on one hand, which is much more willing to deal in a realpolitik manner, as Hunter said, towards the junta, and I think Japan and Australia have been quite reluctant to issue sanctions and pressure on the level of the United States. I think what's really interesting is actually if you compare Australia and Japan's responses to the Ukraine crisis, they're much more vocal in their criticism of Russia, much more willing to join the US sanctions regime. But then on Myanmar, they were very, very quiet on this issue, actually. And then unwilling to ramp these sort of pressure points up, lest they lose access in the future.
And interesting to note, Lucas, that in very recent times, both Japan and Australia have changed governments.
Mm-hmm. I'd also note Singapore's the discrepancy in Singapore's response to Ukraine, Russia, and the Myanmar coup. It's said it opposes sanctions on Myanmar military, while it was very fast to announce sanctions against Russia, which was unprecedented for Singapore. And Singapore has a lot of financial leverage over the Myanmar military, where allegedly it's parked a lot of its overseas assets in Singaporean banks. So actually, State Department Counselor Derek Chollet has traveled to Singapore at least twice now to talk with their policymakers about using such leverage to sort of tighten the purse of the Myanmar military. And so far, it seems like it's been unwilling to do so, even though it was alone in ASEAN to announce sanctions on Russia after it invaded Ukraine.
And that was unexpected, you say?
It was unexpected. As far as I know, Singapore has not used economic sanctions in the past, and it was very quick to do so in response to Russia. But Singapore frequently says we're a small country, and we rely on respect for international law, and oppose a system or an international order where might makes right. Because for them, they don't have a huge military deterrent. They rely on the open international order and free commerce and trade to really remain strong and viable as a country.
Yeah, you're in Thailand, so you're much closer to the scene. Tell us what you're hearing and seeing in that part of the world.
Actually, I'm not that expert in foreign relation. Rather than I focus on the narrative construction of the social movement and the how the current resistance is going. I mean, kind of more focusing on the how narrative develops among the youth and the current status. So I think I should give the floor to Yet or someone else who are expressing somehow on foreign policy or somehow.
Koyi, please give us your thoughts.
Thank you, Sir Henders, for your brilliant presentations. And also, I agree with your points. So rather than commenting, I have questions for you. So I want to know what's your predictions of the future conflict trend. So we have already seen So according to our data, there has been there have been conflict in 266 townships out of 330 townships, the whole countries. So you can see it can be increasing upward trends in the future, in the foreseeable future. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, that's an interesting statistic. And similarly, another friend in Chin State told me in his home village, the military has now burned down two out of every 3 houses in his village. So with such overwhelming violence across the country and indiscriminatory violence against its own people, crimes against humanity, it's unspeakable. This is the strategy that the Tatmadaw has always used in its counterinsurgency, the 4 cuts, as you well know. And it's not sustainable. This level of violence directed at your own people, it's clear that it's state terrorism, and it's designed, I use that word terrorism because it's designed to inflict fear on a people and convince them not to resist, that resistance is futile. But when you burn down homes of people across the country, it seems very clear to me that there is no other option for them. You took away the option of peaceful resistance in March when you saw the military start firing at people and killing innocent teenagers in the street for protesting peacefully. And at this point, more and more people across Myanmar are taking up arms. And even though the PDFs, the People's Defense Forces, have such a huge asymmetric disadvantage and are using homemade rifles to fight against this military, which has Russian imported Chinese technology and military hardware from Israel and Ukraine, nevertheless, the will to fight is stronger on the side of the people and than it is on the military, I think. And you see limited defections. I don't want to be too optimistic about hope for the military to fall apart overnight. And really, I don't think we have a clear grasp of how many the military has lost at this point. But every day I read reports of casualties in the Myanmar military, whether in Sagaing or in Mandalay, even in Naypyidaw, near the capital of the country now. And it doesn't really give me hope to see the country bleed itself. But at the same time, there may come a tipping point. Much of this is impossible to predict. And the Myanmar military could lose enough of its lower ranking soldiers. It's tried to enforce mandatory training on the wives of soldiers now in the Myanmar military and conscript younger soldiers to join its forces. So it's clear that it's feeling some of this pain. And I think it's making stupid and rash decisions on the battlefield as well by engaging with the Arakan army, for instance, which has been careful to avoid fighting so far. So at some point, I don't expect the larger ethnic armed organizations like the United Wa State Army, which would really be a game changer, to join the fight. But if the Arakan army does, I think we could see the military on the back foot once again, like it was in 2019. And at that point, more defections could happen. We've already heard about reports of defections from the Myanmar military to the Arakan army. I'm not sure how certain those reports are. They're also quietly, the Australian government is quietly accepting defectors from the Myanmar military to resettle in Australia. And as news of that gets out, it further incentivizes other soldiers to defect, as well as the PDF's sort of nascent program to accept defectors and encourage defectors through sort of one-on-one social media engagement, a simple messaging service to say, how do I defect? And, you build trust slowly and then convince someone to change sides. There's a lot of unhappiness in the lower and middle ranks of the military. And I think that's the reason the top generals like So Win are traveling to Rakhine State to really make speeches to try to boost morale, which is failing. And as even the top generals start losing out on their regular dividend payments from the Myanmar military's corporations, MEC and MEHL, annually, which I think are reported now to have been delayed for at least 6 months, I think you have less power of persuasion to keep the soldiers fighting for Commander-in-Chief Min Aung Hlaing, who launched this coup for his own personal ambitions and not for sound strategic reasons. And that's really not a good answer to your question. But like Lucas, I think things sadly will be decided on the battlefield because of the unwillingness of powerful international actors to act responsibly and proactively, and because the people have made clear that they're willing to fight to make sure that they don't lose their country's future to the military and don't want to let go of the democratic freedoms which they had for roughly a decade, and saw notable economic gains, and saw younger people have access to smartphones and news of the world. I don't think the military is prepared to really grapple with the extent of resistance across the country. And I don't think there's any putting the genie back in the bottle now.
Let me just go around the room, Hunter, and see whether some of our members have questions for you. Marge, let me call on you first.
I'm climbing a learning curve on having this on my television, so excuse me for the slowness. I think I just have an overwhelming curiosity on why this is all happening. With somebody you just commented does a coup because they personally want power. Normally, when somebody is seizing power, it's because they want to retire to Ibiza with $6 billion. What's the positive? Not only what are they fighting for, but what's financing all this?
By financing all this, do you mean the Myanmar military's staying power?
Yeah, if you're going to arrange a coup, you need to not only put together the manpower, you need to have a lot of artillery. And watching Ukraine, we're getting a feeling for just how much and how expensive artillery you need to assemble. So it's an expensive thing to come up, and it sounds like the money is not there for him because of, you're talking about the defections. So where is the money coming from, and what's the point?
Well, the military had a certain amount in reserves already. I can't recall what that number was last year, enough to keep it funded for maybe a year or two. And it also has control over a great number of illicit economic activities, most notably jade and the timber economy, which are really unreported entirely. So that could generate a couple $2 billion to nearly $10 billion per year. Those are really just back of the napkin math I'm doing right now based on reporting I've read over the years. And it's Myanmar Oil and Gas Enterprise, MOGI, which remains unsanctioned by the United States. I think the UK did announce sanctions on MOGI recently. But that also generates at least $1 billion per year for the military. And so that, together with its own domestic arms production, means it can continue to fund and fight its wars. But at the same time, I mentioned its own economic corporations and networks are unable to give the regular dividends which they pay to senior generals, means that they are hurting. And they, or Min Aung Hlaing primarily, has gone around the country really on a personal mission to finance and initiate electricity projects because the country's electric grid has been under so much pressure and is seeing power outages for the first time in a decade at the level they're currently experiencing. You know, when I first went to Myanmar in 2010, power would regularly go off. But just a couple of years later, once more international investment came into the country, you saw the electric grid was more stable. You know, people could count on electricity around the clock. And now the military is unable to guarantee power supplies across the country. And so trying to rely more on China to invest again and start new projects in hydroelectricity dams to get the country's power grid back online. It's interesting you mentioned Ukraine and the Russia invasion there, because actually Myanmar, the military's second largest provider of arms, very close to China, it's near peer as far as military equipment exports go, is Russia. and Russia's air equipment has primarily been behind the Myanmar Air Force's ability to assert dominance on the battlefield. So when its troops go in and don't know the lay of the land, as well as the Kachin Independence Army or various groups in the country's northern periphery, the Myanmar military actually loses soldiers or retreats and has lost territory in some of these states within the country that are fighting against its control. But its air force is able to go in and bomb the resistance forces. So they still have the air superiority. But those Russian helicopters and Russian military planes eventually will need to be repaired by Russian technicians oftentimes. And the price of fuel going up also affects their ability to conduct these operations. So twofold, their Air Force and military is actually suffering on account of the Russian invasion and their reliance on Russia's military equipment. So you might be right that they definitely have some areas of concern with regard to their ability to finance and continue to fight and keep power.
Thank you.
I also
Maritza,
put a link down below. As far as the reasons behind the coup, you know, I was teasing out a few different motivating factors early days after the coup, particularly looking at the language the military used to justify its coup with reference to the 2008 Constitution and whether it took seriously its claims to be upholding democracy and the Constitution via the coup, as well as its claims of electoral fraud from the 2020 election, and then ultimately looking at Min Aung Hlaing's own personal motivations for the coup, which I think were really paramount to his decision to launch the coup. Because as I argue, the NLD didn't actually represent a threat to the military's hold on power or constitutional power. Its challenge in the parliament didn't amount to genuine constitutional reform, which undermined the military's control. And at the same time, Min Aung Hlaing was supposed to retire at the age of 65, and instead he found a different future.
Hunter, I've downloaded that link, and I will send that out in an email to our members. Thank you for sending that very much. Maritza, do you have a question for Hunter and the gang?
Perhaps the history of this country is part of this instability because of the colonial powers that maybe disrupted the power structure and then decamped after the war?
In short, yes. The longer answer is that specifically it advantaged certain groups and disadvantaged others. So the Burmans, the majority ethnic group, which represent about 2/3 of the country, have historically been aggrieved at the legacy of British colonial rule, which brought in both Indian administrators from India, which was actually part or jointly administered with Burma as part of the British Raj until I think 1923 or I forget the exact year, where they nominally separated the two into different administrative states. But at the same time, they also empowered the Karen ethnic group, which fought alongside the British. Thank you, Koye, 1937. I'd forgotten my history. And different groups like the Karen, who fought alongside the British and the Allied powers during World War II, which, though a smaller group, had certain privileges within and compared to the Burma army. So some of those tensions really broke out into the open immediately after independence between the Karen and Burmans, notably. And the army was never able to successfully integrate various ethnic groups into a national army. And that also hinges a bit on Aung San Suu Kyi's father, General Aung San, and his early efforts at state building with what's called the Panglong conference, which took place in, now I'm really forgetting my history, in Shan State, was it? In 1947, the first conference? Was that right, Manyanyan, or yeah? So this conference really started to make some of, actually today, comparatively speaking, some of the claims and promises in the first Panglong conference were far more progressive than what the military is comfortable talking about today, promising a degree of autonomy to ethnic minority states and allowing them to govern their own regions, and also the ability to secede from the Union in 10 years if they weren't happy with the state of affairs. So that sort of unfinished nation building project was really sort of an open wound in the country's early independence, which continues to really be a tragic and unresolved project in the country today. And so Aung San Suu Kyi sought to actually resume this Panglong conference with her own peace talks. But unfortunately, the military and ethnic armed groups had really not come to an agreement about what autonomy meant and what federalism meant. And actually, it resisted the use of the word federalism very explicitly for many years. So these are very delicate topics even today, and much of that hinges back to the British colonial legacy. There's some very interesting books I could refer you to. I'm not sure if my report mentions in the end, but perhaps our Myanmar speakers or panelists today can help with that as well.
Thank you.
Anne, do you have a question?
No, because I was interested in how the military was financed, and what is the jade that you're talking about? Who are the traders in that?
The majority of jade, as far as I know, comes from Kachin State, and much of it historically was controlled by the Kachin Independence Army and Kachin Independence Organization, which has sort of fought for a degree of political freedom and ability to sort of regulate the internal economy of its own state. But since the coup, the Myanmar military has reportedly been attacking some of these areas to actually get control over the jade industry again. Much of the jade and gem sector generally is sanctioned. So in the United States, we can't buy jade or rubies from Myanmar specifically. And I think those sanctions remained in effect after the Obama years continually. Despite the removal of most sanctions on Myanmar businesses and American businesses doing business in Myanmar. But at this point, I think the military, I don't know what the percentage, the breakdown is, but the Myanmar military controls a great deal of the jade economy, but not all, some of which is still under control by Kachin stakeholders. But again, much of that is unreported, and a great deal of the gems trade across the border to China and in gems emporiums to private sellers and buyers is not reported, not regulated, and not taxed. So this has meant that for many years, a large portion of the economy, which already is very thinly taxed, potentially contributing revenue to healthcare and education and other things, has not been filling state coffers and instead gone into the private hands of military, senior generals, and tycoons, as well as its partners across the border in China and Yunnan province.
Thank you, Hunter. Susan, do you have a question?
No, the other thing I was just, Hunter, thank you again for your very illuminating lecture for us. I was just looking at some of the healthcare demographics and looking at the maternal mortality rates of 250 compared to the US of 23, and looking at that they still have a significant amount of malaria and TB. And so when you talk about polio and World Health and all of that, I mean, how do you, if the country can't sustain the health of its community as part of a role of government, they have other impacts on mortality separate from COVID and the military excursions. So I find it very distressing.
Absolutely. And I think Aung San Suu Kyi and her government did try to sort of rebalance the budget. But at the same time, we're trying to woo the military to a certain extent to build trust that her party didn't represent a threat to the military, because ultimately what she wanted was for democracy to succeed. And she made some controversial choices in her efforts to do so. But ultimately, much of the budget still didn't go to healthcare and education, which have relied in part on international donors and various sort of philanthropists to engage in, as well as missionaries and religious organizations. But sadly remains very underfunded. And COVID and the isolation that has resulted from the coup have only really exacerbated those problems.
So this is a really off the wall question, but in China, the birth rate of boys to girls is disproportionate based on previous one-child policies. Does that impact what happens to women in Burma Myanmar being part of the sex trade or trafficking based on those disproportionate numbers since they're sharing a border with China?
I wish I knew more about that, but given other countries having similar problems with the border with China, I would assume that some Myanmar women are probably entering into such arrangements with Chinese husbands across the border. Mm-hmm. Lucas and Manyen are nodding their heads. Maybe they would know more.
Yeah, I agree with Hendra. Like Myanmar has also the similar problem with the other country like Laos and the Thailand have. It's like human trafficking a lot, especially targeting. It's like kind of gender human trafficking, because like most of the male migrant workers like came to migrant worker on the right track of the safe and regular migration, but women are affected and suffer from those illegal or we call informal migration, and women mostly and falling under the trap of the kind of as you mentioned, the sex trade or sort of thing.
And does Buddhism have an impact on that? For example, that it's somehow not permissible, but it's considered fate or karma that people have these sort of livelihoods, or especially for children, children that are trafficked?
It's like I wish I could know more about on that kind of perspective, but most of the literature like look from the how the human trafficking goes. It's like kind of mostly focusing from the like migration perspective, how they are irregularly done and how they are irregularly like how they are like kind of and safely done by the those illegal trafficker.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and Buddhism, I probably should have talked about that more. I did mention the role of Buddhism in a recent paper on Myanmar foreign policy, actually, because historically Buddhism has informed various administrations' foreign policies and the way they sort of talk about economic self-reliance and sort of international goodwill diplomacy and things like that, dating back to U Nu, the country's first prime minister, who was a very devout Buddhist. But at the same time, because of the traditional role of Theravada Buddhism and some of its sort of conservative values, the country is still very patriarchal. And I think women have generally a hard time, even though there's so many young Myanmar women who I can think of are natural leaders in their communities and civil society organizations. But I don't think that's a worldview that's really shared by the Myanmar military, for instance.
Okay.
I must confess, I was quite shocked to see videos of how violent Buddhist monks can be. I suppose the little that I know about Buddhism is that the stereotypical image of monks begging on the street, waiting for to be given their daily meals from devout pilgrims, was a very different sight for them attacking the Rohingya Muslim and those images that we saw in the media.
That's right, and actually parallels a little bit with Sri Lanka and its own civil war, which largely hinged on ethnic and religious lines with the Tamil Tigers and the Buddhist Sinhalese.
There was a movie that came out a few years ago entitled All Saints, which was about, which taught us in the West a lot more about the Karen people that was settled here and their story of being refugees. And since I work for a church, I often recommend this movie. It is a good movie for those that are engaged in ministry because it teaches you to think outside your paradigm. But I digress. Are there any other comments? It's coming up to 8 o'clock. Are there any other comments that people would like to make? I realize we've been at this for 90 minutes and any final thoughts, as they say on the news programs?
I was in Burma in '89. One of the things that I was real discouraged about was the water system. Almost every place we visited or went, including big cities and the countryside, the water was dirty and the people were using it to drink and wash and whatever. That was in '89. Have they done much to, they talk about the electric grid, but what about sanitation and water?
Well, I don't know anything about this really. I can only hope that international groups like UNDP have perhaps improved things along with Myanmar's own civil society organizations which have sprung up.
Lucas, do you have any final thoughts? No? Nyan Nyan, do you have any final thoughts? No? Koyi? No? Are you all done? My goodness. Hunter, that just goes to show what an amazing lecturer you are and how well you educated us on this topic. So, and thank you for recording this. And Hunter's going to put this on his own YouTube channel, and hope